Good afternoon. Welcome to St. John's University. Thank you very much for coming out this afternoon on what might look like a more beautiful day than we thought it might be this morning. So we appreciate you taking the time to join us this afternoon. We have a special guest with us today, whom I will allow Dan Finn to introduce in just a moment. But I just want to note that this is kicking off inaugural weekend events, and we wanted to kick off the events with an academic lecture that emphasized that the primary mission of this institution, of the university, is academic. And we want, for all the other things that we do well here, we want to note that the primary focus of our institution is academic, and it's educating undergraduates, graduate students in theology, and priests. And what we want to do today is talk a little bit about the role of a Catholic university in the higher ed firmament these days. There's a lot of conversation about what should be going on in higher education, what new models should look like, what education might look like 5, 10, 15 years down the road. And we're going to have these conversations at St. John's and St. Ben's for years to come, no doubt. But this afternoon we're going to focus our attention on a specific aspect of that question, which is not only where does a small residential liberal arts college fit in the higher education world, but where does a Catholic small residential liberal arts college fit in that world? And we have an expert with us today to help us think about these kinds of questions, the kinds of conversations that we're going to be having on campus again well into the future, long after inauguration events are over. So let me begin by introducing, I guess, my colleague, Dan Finn, since I'm also a proud member of the economics department here. I was a student at St. John's and graduated in 1981, and I never had the pleasure of having a class from Professor Finn, but I found him to be kind of an anomalous character at the time. I mean, for lots of reasons, but let me be specific. The specific reasons were he had a joint position, and as an undergraduate, I didn't really know what exactly that meant, not knowing that much about higher education, but even at the time I had a sense that a joint position in 2 departments was a little bit unusual, and then to discover that he had a joint position in economics and theology was, that kind of blew my little undergraduate mind. I thought, this guy must be pretty interesting. I'm sorry I'm not going to get a chance to take a class from him. Little did I know I would get the chance to come back many years later and have him as a colleague. So let me introduce you to Dan Finn, the William and Virginia Clemens Professor of Economics. And you can read a little bit more about him in the program, but I'll let him introduce his friend, who's our special guest today. So, Professor Finn.
Thank you for a kind introduction. I'm glad he said unusual and not odd. It is an honor today to introduce our speaker, who was ordained a priest in the Society of Mary, the Marianists, nearly 4 decades ago. He earned his PhD in historical theology at the University of Toronto. He's been a teacher of English and religion in high school, but spent nearly all of his career at the University of Dayton, a Marianist university. He has been professor there, chair of the Department of Religious Studies, also provost, also university professor of faith and culture, and eventually chancellor of the university. He is currently the president of the Institute for Advanced Catholic Studies, which is located at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles, and is also Elton Brooks Professor of Religion at USC. He has a wide range of membership and service on various committees and boards. I'll mention just 3 that make some connection with some folks here. He's been a member of the board of Collegium, which a number of our faculty have participated in, member and chair of the board of the Association of Catholic Colleges and Universities, to which our 2 colleges are members, of course, and also a member of the U.S. Bishops' Committee on Education. He's received a number of awards, including outstanding teaching at the University of Dayton, and awards for scholarship, honorary degrees from other colleges and universities. He's been the author or editor of some dozen books. I'll refer to only 4 here that are most relevant to us. One, The Faith and Intellectual Life. He's also edited 3 fascinating volumes arising from a dialogue that he has arranged among scholars of Judaism, Catholicism, and Islam. And these include topics beyond violence, passing on the faith, and quite interesting, learned ignorance, how each of these traditions understands intellectual humility, something we could use a lot more of during our campaign season, we know, huh? He's written scores of articles in both scholarly journals and popular journals, and two major themes are quite interesting for our experience here today. He's written quite a bit on academic freedom, something he's quite committed to, but is also, from his own historical background, a real expert, one of the world's experts, on papal infallibility. And we find in this person these tensions brought together, which in a wonderful way. His more popular work, often drawing contemporary Catholics to understand many of the very traditional parts of our Catholic tradition, the Immaculate Conception, sexuality and confession, baptism, conscious formation, and lots of other work having to do with Catholic identity and the Church, the moral development of college students, and another interesting article, Can Character Be Taught? Quite important for us, huh? Perhaps the most broadly significant undertaking of our speaker's life is the one he's currently invested in, this Institute for Advanced Catholic Studies, of which he's the founding president. I have the privilege of co-directing one of the Institute's research projects and serving on its board. Its mission is to bring together scholars, both Catholics and others, to investigate, debate, and develop the Catholic intellectual tradition across all the disciplines. I believe it's the most promising institutional development for this tradition in the U.S. since the founding of Catholic colleges in the 18th and 19th centuries. And it would not be happening were it not for our speaker's talent and dedication and vision. The great Lutheran theologian Paul Tillich once taught that the stature of a person can be measured by the accomplishment of two things simultaneously: committing to a fundamental set of convictions in life, and simultaneously bringing into one's understanding and consciousness dissonant elements that both challenge and enrich those convictions. Tillich cautioned that too much of this kind of challenge leads to a disintegration of the person, but that stronger persons can internalize greater dissonance while sustaining a deep personal integration. As I believe will soon be clear to all of us, our speaker this afternoon has lived just such a life. Today we hear an address entitled Benedictine Education in the 21st Century. Please join me in welcoming Father James Heft.
Can I see the audience a little bit more, please? Thank you very much, Dan. That's more than generous of you, especially since you're one of my bosses. I've just asked that the lights be turned up a little because I find it difficult to speak to people I can't see. So they're going to do this a little bit. Okay, that helps. You are there. Good, thank you. Abbot John, President Hemasath, Benedictine brothers and sisters, members of the Board of Trustees, faculty and students. It really is an honor to be with you on this very special occasion and to be invited to offer a few comments as Michael Hemasath, a graduate of St. John's, is about to be inaugurated as the first lay president of the university. I have to tell you that for many years, I have loved and admired the Benedictines. I have respect for all religious orders, but I really can't say that about all of them. My own religious community, the Marianists, is composed of mostly brothers. And this strong majority of brothers makes a richer community life possible. When you're all priests, the tendency to go out, say Mass here, and then it's more difficult to have common prayer. I love this structure of our own society, and it's necessary that for a person to be ordained in my order, a brother, I consider myself a brother who happens to be ordained, it's necessary for the brothers with whom he has lived the previous 3 years to approve the ordination. You think of those Roman emperors, you know, they go. this has happened. And the reason for this is simple. The first obligation of a Marianist priest is to serve his brothers, not the brothers to serve the priests. Such a strong sense of consultation and democracy is not, of course, strange to the Benedictines. The irrepressible Andrew Greeley once wrote in one of your books, A Sense of Place, and I quote him, "The Benedictine tradition is the oldest, uninterrupted, democratic tradition in the world." That's impressive. It's also true. There's a second parallel between my order and the Benedictines. We both have sisters. Even more significant, in my opinion, is the relationship that exists between St. John and St. Benedict's. Given the powerful women's movement of the last 100 years, and it's hardly fully played out, I believe special benefits often flow from having a sister congregation. For example, they make clear to their brothers what male-only orders have difficulty grasping. You filled in the blanks awfully quickly. May I continue? What male-only orders have difficulty grasping, colon. This is going to be a long night. The clericalized nature of too much of the Catholic Church. Let us continue to learn from the sisters and not just about a more balanced ecclesiology. The final introductory comment I wish to make on this occasion is its unique nature. It is unique, I think, for two reasons. First, you have for the first time chosen a lay person, as president. This same transition to lay leadership has taken place over the past 20 years in all three of the Marianist universities in my world. When it has worked well, it has been a marvelous example of collaboration between the religious communities, which established those great institutions, and its new leadership, lay leadership. But it can also be a realization, and sometimes a sad one, that the religious order can no longer find within its own ranks qualified candidates for such religious leadership, academic leadership. When this arrangement, however, does not go well, and I've seen it a couple times not go well, people grumble. If I recall correctly, in the Rule of Benedict, grumbling is mentioned many times as perhaps the most toxic thing for a community. C.S. Lewis once wrote about the importance of distinguishing between a grumble and a grumbler. A grumble is inescapable. We all have them at times. But if it actually becomes your essay, your being, a grumbler, deadly. Almost inevitably, it seems to me, some people will fear secularization and the loss of the unique Benedictine spirit, and so on. None of this needs to be the case. Having appointed a competent graduate of the university is certainly a wise step, but it is not by itself sufficient. The second reason this occasion is unique is that for the first time in over 150-year history of this institution, it has created a new civil corporation that separates the university and the abbey. You no longer have a board of regents, but now a board of trustees with full fiduciary responsibility. In one of your most recent alumni publications, I read that this new arrangement allows the abbey to have, and I quote it, a clear line of commitment to the Catholic and Benedictine identity, end quote, of the university, and the trustees, I quote again, a clear sense of their responsibility for the university's financial affairs, end quote. In my comments that follow, you will see that I also believe that a predominantly lay board of trustees has just as great a responsibility for the Catholic mission of the university as do the Benedictines. whose financial acumen has kept this institution alive and thriving for over a century and a half. Now, all of that said about the unique characteristics of this moment in this university, I want to now ask a couple of questions. And mainly, the questions I'm going to ask could be characterized as the kind of challenges that I think are facing Catholic universities today. It is important to understand, however, the immense diversity of Catholic higher education in the United States, not just in terms of size, but also, at least for some, in terms of their vision of Catholicism. I don't know if you know this, but 1/6 of all the Catholic colleges and universities in the world are in the United States, and among them some of the most sophisticated and developed. And this has been done by 6% of the world's Catholics. It's very interesting. There's a lot of history here of coming to a Protestant country and so on and so forth. But it's a fascinating statistic, and it's one that Rome takes very much into consideration. I think it was very much the reason why the one place that Rome worked very hard to make sure ex corde could be implemented, the first place was the United States. It was both good and bad, but it worked out. There has never been a national plan for Catholic universities in this country. It's the free enterprise system. Not only that, not even the Jesuits, who in the 1930s attempted to create a national plan for their universities, have been able to succeed at it. I don't know if you know this, but they realized that they were going to do graduate education at a top level. They had to have a big endowment, and all their places were not there. So they said, let's pool our resources. Great idea. Never happened. And the place they picked to do it was St. Louis University. And the individual provincials and the others, they just ended up saying, we think collaboration's a great idea. As a consequence, our institutions compete not only with public institutions that receive sizable federal subsidies, but also with each other, and even sometimes compete with institutions founded by the same religious order. So, for example, just in my area, you've got University of San Francisco, which is Jesuit. Just down the road, you've got Santa Clara. A bit down the road, you've got Loyola Marymount. You know, it's really striking. In the state of Ohio, where I was for a long time, you only had two. One, John Carroll, the other, Xavier University. But they compete. They compete. You could say, what's wrong with this picture? Well, it's part of the culture. It's part of the way we've done it. Religious communities often work in ways that they want to survive, they want to make a stamp, and so it goes. Moreover, our universities are of many sizes, with endowments of either greater differences in size, and shaped often by different visions of Catholicism and different conceptions of their academic missions and even academic freedom. St. John's and St. Ben's, each single-sex institutions, joined in the tradition of a single religious tradition with the longest continuous history of existence in the Catholic Church, makes this place, in my opinion, unlike any other place in the United States. There is something very important here that must not only be preserved, it has to be strengthened and enhanced. You students here, you may not recognize it, but it is very unique. I've been around to a lot of places. Given such diversity among our institutions, can any valid generalizations be made about the mission of such different Catholic colleges and universities in the U.S.? More specifically, can anything helpful be said about St. John's and as it now goes forward for the first time in its history with a lay president and a new governance structure? There is one generalization that I think most observers of Catholic higher ed in the United States would support, and it's this. Since Vatican II, most Catholic colleges and universities have opened themselves more to the larger culture, to lay leadership, as well as to many of the trends of secular higher education, including a more highly professionalized faculty that participates more fully in the governance of their institutions. Some have described this process as one of secularization, and they don't like it. Others have viewed it simply as improving the academic quality. They like it. Still others, the religious founders of Catholic institutions among them, can see this as an appropriate recognition of the talents of the laity and an invitation for the founding religious communities to collaborate truly in this way for the first time in the history of the Church. Now, I believe that one of the biggest challenges facing Catholic higher education today, and I'm going to mention 4 of these challenges. The first one is to understand the religious mission of our institutions in intellectual terms that relate to the disciplines. I'm not into Enlightenment bashing. There are aspects of the Enlightenment that I think are very important, including almost goading the Church, pushing the Church to recognize freedom of conscience, recognize the importance of the separation of church and state, and so on. But I do think that one of the consequences of the Enlightenment has been the privatization of religion. You might not know it in the United States. You can see it more clearly in Europe. But one thing for sure is we've gotten to a point in many Catholic universities, I hear the language, I'm sure you do it here too, of faith and culture, or faith and reason. Faith and reason. It becomes kind of like boilerplate. But the problem is, in doing work with faculty development, I often find this, or put it this way, I would know that this would never happen to a St. John's student or St. Ben's student, but if I always have this fantasy of one of my students being interviewed on the street with a camera rolling and someone asking them, what is faith? And they answer, faith is accepting something without any evidence. I think a lot of people think that. I try to teach my students you can't prove God's existence and you can't disprove it any more than you can prove you've married the right person or made a commitment for life to celibacy. It feels right. It moves in the right direction. I make a pledge. I make a promise. I dedicate myself to it, but I can't prove it. The most important decisions we have to make, we can't prove. That dimension of epistemology is often overlooked because reason is understood as science, logic. If you think of reason as narrative, analogy, parable, example, these are very rich ways to communicate, but they're not seen quite as reason. I'm not sure what they're seen as. So when we say faith and reason, I think it's absolutely crucial that we avoid the cultural stereotypes of what these two things are. That's so strong. And if we don't avoid them, we lose some of the best of the Catholic tradition. I think it's also important when I say we've got to relate Catholic intellectual life to the disciplines. Now this can cause migraines, depending on the people. One of the books Dan didn't mention that Notre Dame Press published this past year was one I co-edited with the chair of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering at the University of Dayton. And the title of the book is Engineering Education and Practice, Embracing a Catholic Vision. It grew out of a year-long interdisciplinary seminar. And interdisciplinary seminars, I think, can be very valuable. But one thing interdisciplinarity does not mean is becoming incompetent in two disciplines. And I often hear this objection, and there are people that fear doing that, except odd people that, get into economics and theology. But there are people that fear doing that because they feel like they would lose out within the discipline and the recognition they could receive and the status. It becomes a problem. I don't think the problem is specialization. You see this especially in science. If there is not specialization, there are not the breakthroughs. The problem is fragmentation. So even with interdisciplinarity, I don't like people to lose their expertise, but I want them to have peripheral vision. A way to be able to sense, I can't answer some really important questions in my discipline alone, and I'll refer you to, or somebody else can help. This is the beginning of building the integration that a Catholic tradition should really try to treasure. I might mention, not that this is a model, but it worked for us at Dayton for a long time. We did these cross-disciplinary faculty seminars with reduced teaching loads spread over a full year. It was expensive, but it was worth it. And among them, we did Catholicism and the professions. We did some stuff with economics. I think what Dan has been doing with economics is really very, very impressive. I don't know if you saw the most recent issue of Time magazine. I try to do serious scholarly work on a regular basis. But there was a story, did you see it, on gross national product, or GNH, gross national happiness. And they were trying to take indicators of living that would be more comprehensive as an index to try to understand what makes people really alive rather than just a financial balance sheet. Nothing against economics. But Joseph Stiglitz is one of the movers in this. Amartya Sen is another one, where they do try to, well, you see it in business too when they start saying, let's expand what we understand by stakeholders. Let's include the larger community. That's how we'll measure who we are and what we do. These are all very positive signs. I think, for example, in the social sciences, the vehicle having a sense of what the nature of the human person is and a Christian vision, which is someone who's both physical and spiritual, someone who is an individual but yet part of a community, someone who has a sense of themselves because they're part of a tradition, a history. Once you do that, you do even a better job than the great William James did in his varieties of religious experience. He was trying to avoid the reductionist and the philosophers. He wanted to do something in between, but he ended up with individual consciousness. That would never be satisfactory within a Catholic tradition. The community is important, the tradition is important, rituals and symbols are important, and that's not just sporting events. I might mention, in cross-disciplinary discussions, we always had three themes. The first one was a history of Catholic higher ed in the United States, just to get a sense of where we are. How do you put yourself on the line? Where are you? Second would be a history of your discipline. And I noticed that one of our speakers teaches the history of psychology. Now, you're going to tell me if this is true, but I'm going to make a kind of conclusion about this. And that is, a lot of academics don't know the history of their disciplines. If you know the history of your discipline, you know that the way it is now is not the way it was. And if it was not the way it was and it is now, it might be able to change. And you might even be able to play a role in shaping and making more comprehensive your own discipline. The last one was the Catholic intellectual tradition. So those are things that we worked at in the sciences. I think there are all kinds of things that can be done. Some very interesting ones. We're starting a thing on neuroscience, a research track on neuroscience and the soul. And we're going to bring together some of the best scholars we can find in the country and in the world, sit down, and if they aren't the best scholars, you know, if they're pious but second-rate scientists, it's not going to work. If they're agnostic but open and great scholars, it can work. So you've got to be able to do that, and I think then you begin to see the connections that are really rich. I could give other examples if you want. But traveling around the country, I often get the impression that too many people assume that the religious mission first belongs to the campus ministry and the theology department, and after that, to the rest of the faculty who in their classrooms are to be fair, kind, and generous. You students know that it's important for faculty to be fair, kind, and generous. But all chairs of departments know when faculty aren't, it takes up far too much of their time. However, the reduction of a religious tradition to simply good and kind behavior robs that tradition of both its intellectual and prophetic edges. As a consequence, few people understand that mission in terms that translate into distinctive curricula and research because of that, distinctive research and teaching that are even more challenging and more worthwhile. In our more sophisticated universities, especially those with many doctoral programs, the religious and ethical dimensions are often left implicit, if not invisible. Timothy O'Meara, who was, to my way of thinking, the principal architect of the academic programs at Notre Dame, he was there for 18 years, once made a remark to me that really made sense. He said, you know, we have a pretty good idea what a Catholic college is. We can figure out the core curriculum, so on and so forth, but we still don't know what a Catholic university is. Catholic university is much more complex, much more difficult to do, particularly with the way doctoral studies are designed. And how to integrate knowledge, how to do that well at that level is very difficult. Understanding Catholicism as a tradition that makes cognitive claims, not just as an intellectual tradition, constitutes an especially major challenge in a culture that, as I have mentioned, prefers to privatize religion or make religion a matter of opinion. You can think what you want, fine, just don't impose it on me. It seems to me that a place like St. John's, with its great liturgical tradition, its commitment to ecumenism, to the land, and to building a strong community within a relatively small number of faculty and students, most of you students are residential, should be much better at grasping Catholicism in a palpably comprehensive way, and a lived way that includes not only the intellectual life, but moral formation. If respect for the environment and care for creation is more crucial than ever, certainly St. John's can credibly promote this conviction. Where else is it one likely to read annually in an alumni publication the size and weight in pounds and bushels of the Abbey's garden produce? I was amazed when I read that. We are less landlords than we are tenants, confided with loving stewardship of God's creation. Given the pervasive commercialization of U.S. culture, many Catholics find it difficult to understand Catholicism as a profound intellectual and cultural tradition. The challenge of commercialism may be seen on three levels. This is my second challenge. First is grasping Catholicism as an intellectual tradition. Second is commercialism, and I see it on three levels. First, administrators, including members of boards of trustees, often run the risk of thinking primarily in terms of models taken from the business world, models that will maximize revenue, bureaucratize all transactions, that commercial where you have one or two smiling faces and then they say, for everything else, MasterCard. Speak of faculty as employees and students as customers or consumers, and who believe that if an institution can successfully brand itself, then it can also quantify all important outcomes of a university education. Of course, any university that cannot balance its budget eventually ceases to exist. As we say, no margin, no mission. But I wish to stress here that the mission is about much more than a good margin, and that managerial expertise is no substitute for academic leadership. We speak of the importance of faculty formation, but not as often as we should about board formation. Any budget is, in the last analysis, a moral statement that either embodies and strengthens that distinctive mission of the university or reduces it to a business operation which balances its budget. Among faculty, commercialization expresses itself in those who think only of their own discipline and career advancement, who are not interested in seeking connections between different fields of knowledge, and who think that intellectual traditions rooted in faith traditions are irrelevant and detrimental to their disciplines and their academic freedom. They can be, but they need not be. This attitude among faculty constitutes a formidable challenge, at least in a number of places, probably less so here, especially at those institutions that have many doctoral programs. And since in the end it's, and I'm quoting Alistair McIntyre here, only the faculty who can secure the Catholic identity of the university and determine what kind of identity it is and what its form of academic expression should be, then it is crucial that there be not just scholars who are Catholic, but Catholic scholars in a variety of disciplines. In view of this commercial force, I believe that hiring and developing Catholic scholars is one of the greatest needs of the present time. That's a highly controversial statement, and I'm quite aware of it. And I'll come back and try to qualify it in a number of ways. But I would mention to you that one of the things that we did at Dayton for many years, for 15 years, every fall, I chaired a hiring for mission workshop. I mean, you could say in one sense, who wouldn't hire for mission? Do you fire for mission? How does this work? Especially if you understand mission as intellectual. We would go off campus to a retreat center, 24 hours, with a group of about 25 people, chairs of departments, at least one dean, chairs of search committees. And we'll say, what is this stuff about? We spend a good deal of time saying what it is not to hire someone for mission. And there are a lot of stereotypes, hiring pious but dumb Catholics, not hiring someone who's not Catholic. All that is nonsense. That's a waste of time. You could ask someone who is Catholic, you can't by federal law, but you could, are you Catholic? And that wouldn't necessarily tell you anything. It wouldn't tell you about their intellectual vitality or the extent to which they grasp that tradition in an intellectual way. Non-Catholic faculty are, of course, important members of the college community because, again, to quote Alistair McIntyre, they contribute their own excellence to the learning process and help Catholics remember that the secular calling of the university qua university is shared with everyone. The contemporary university is one of the few places in the world where ecumenical and interfaith encounters and explorations can be sustained. Finally, a word to the students. They present their own challenge. Newman once remarked that if the church did not have them, they'd look rather foolish. A college without students is not a college. It may be a research institute, but it will lack the vitality that arises when faculty and students engage each other in the pursuit of truth. Just as administrators and faculty can be influenced by the commercial culture, students can become so focused on acquiring marketable skills in order to land a good job, meaning one that pays well, that they see no market value in the liberal arts, which a place like St. John's should specialize in, to say nothing more specifically of philosophy and theology. Newman, a lot of people don't know this, Newman thought that the sciences could be taught in a liberal way, that it's not just the humanities. Catholic colleges and administrators and faculty must help such students see beyond what they want to what in fact they most need, an integrated educational experience rooted in a distinctive religious tradition that will sustain them in whatever profession they choose. Instead, we may end up graduating highly trained students who in fact are just narrowly focused professionals. One of the reasons that it's difficult to withstand the forces of commercialization is that a faith-based culture, the Catholic subculture if you will, is not as dominant as the national culture. If I propose that Catholicism should be an alternative culture, note, I'm not proposing here a Niebuhrian Catholicism against culture model, though there are obviously trends within the culture that Catholics should oppose. Then we are faced with a second challenge, understanding better than we do what Catholicism is. For sure, Catholics are a community of sinners. We generate our own share of negative realities, and the media publicizes them. Though a majority of Christians in the United States are Protestant, they are no longer a majority of the believers. I saw a poll just recently that said that they number 48%, Protestants do. Catholics get more than their fair share of media coverage, whether it's the marriage issue recently, various things on contraception, and so on. If candidates for faculty positions bring with them primarily a media exposure to Catholicism, they will understandably either self-select out of the process or assume that they need to avoid Catholicism if they are to enjoy a robust intellectual life. We face, I believe, not just an unpopular picture of Catholicism presented by the media. For centuries, especially since the Enlightenment, the cultural elite rarely saw in Christianity a rich foundation for the intellectual life. And indeed, some religious leaders have, by their utterances and policies, given rise to that perception. The challenge, then, is not to lower Catholicism, the profile, and rely on the charism of the religious orders, who have founded over 90% of all the Catholic colleges and universities in this country. The reason is that there are a number of religious orders who have founded institutions of higher education that don't have much of an intellectual tradition. As I like to say when I speak to Jesuits, the church existed for 1,500 years before you guys came along, and founded some of the great universities 300 years before you were founded. So, It is rather to rehabilitate the image of Catholicism. We cannot and shouldn't even try to control the media, though our public relations departments are often preoccupied with this challenge. But we might be able to shape creatively and thoughtfully an important part of that reality, that is Catholic higher education, that the media sometimes covers. If we don't, I speak to this community and I speak to a lot of academics, if we don't define what Catholic higher education is about, the media or someone else will do it. So it's really crucial for us to take that initiative. What then should constitute the foundation of a Catholic university? The third challenge is to choose a solid foundation on which to build. This is nothing new, but what does it mean? In view of the popular, largely negative perceptions that are out there, some people in Catholic universities emphasize the so-called small c rather than the capital C of Catholicism. In this practice, the small c focuses on ideas that most everyone will find acceptable. That dimension of Catholicism that is said to be all-inclusive, that affirms the both-and approach, that celebrates the value of reasoning, such as the natural law tradition, very important, since it suggests a common humanity and a basis for universal human rights, and themes related to creation, ecology. They might sound like the Democratic Party at prayer, but these are really easy to embrace. In doing so, such people avoid what appears to them as the sharper and less attractive aspects of Catholicism, namely the magisterium, dogmas, moral teachings, especially those having to do with sexual issues, the ban on the ordination of women to the priesthood, the claim that Jesus is the Savior of the world, and so on, all teachings that seem increasingly hard to defend. Such people believe it would be more attractive and less divisive to speak not about Jesus, but about values, not about dogmas, but of insights, not about truth, but of knowledge, by which they usually mean, when they speak of the institutional church, all that they really don't like about the church. On the other hand, I understand why such people feel the need to emphasize the small c. I want to emphasize both. Some teachings that are not dogmatic are presented as though they are. Some members of the hierarchy close off thinking that is faithful but also critical. And some members of the laity, and indeed some faculty, automatically think that a diversity of views among Catholic scholars is proof of dissent. Nevertheless, I simply want to say that without the big C, the small c will soon morph into Christian values and before long become a bland humanism, and eventually all that is truly distinctive of Catholicism will disappear. To lose our distinctiveness would be especially ironic now, when more and more state universities will be offering minors in Christian studies, and some of them are establishing chairs in Catholic thought. How can our academic programs retain their integrity and depth, and where appropriate, be Catholic with all that that includes, especially a commitment to ecumenical and interreligious dialogue and research, something this university has pioneered in even before Vatican II? Is it not possible that we can be more inclusive because we believe God created everyone in image and likeness, more intellectually stimulated because of dogmas such as creation, incarnation, Trinity, the dignity of every human being regardless of race, ethnicity, religious tradition, or sexual orientation, and more unified because, not despite, of the magisterium? One of the things I think that really needs to be kept in mind, and this is part of the learned ignorance discussion we had. In that book, I contributed a chapter entitled Humble Infallibility. Martin Luther once described humanity as a drunk who gets on a horse and falls off on one side, and then gets back up on the horse and falls off on the other. Not a very positive view of humanity, I admit. But if you think for a moment of what we have now as a dogmatic formulation of the Incarnation, we say, Jesus, those of us who believe as Christians, we say Jesus is truly human and truly divine, but not schizophrenic. Two natures, one person. All right? When you fall off on one side, you lose the view of the other. If you put the two together, it makes it even more incomprehensible. Dogma doesn't explain as much as it affirms and protects. To think that dogmas are the final word is also wrong. One of the best things that came out of the controversy with Hans Küng, who published the book in 1970 about infallibility, a question, was a statement from the CDF in 1973 called Mysterium Ecclesiae that pointed out, and I keep reminding people this document, a fourfold historical conditioning of every dogmatic statement, which is to say they continue, they develop. I have to tell you one thing. It is possible to teach dogma and to teach it in a way that illuminates life. Picture getting this assignment. About 10 years ago, I'll never forget this, one of the national theological groups, the College Theology Society, was meeting at the University of Dayton. So they asked me at the end of the convention to preside at the Eucharist. It was Sunday morning. And it was, in June, it was Trinity Sunday. Try preaching to 300 theologians on Trinity Sunday. So I read the gospel, I put it down, I looked out at them, and I went, and I sat down. Everybody remembers that. I got back up and gave a sermon. Nobody remembers that. I don't even remember what my sermon was that time, but I thought it was a risk, but it does say something about the complexity of the thing. So, to face the challenge, it will be necessary, I think, to dig deeper into Catholicism's rich and multifaceted traditions and make our own important contribution to the description of Catholicism as a living and vital tradition, and find effective ways to communicate this vision, not only amongst ourselves and for our students, but to the wider public as well. You probably heard of that clever little thing, the difference between tradition and traditionalism. Tradition is the living faith of the dead. Traditionalism is the dead faith of the living. Tradition is the living faith of the dead. It's so deep, it's so rich, no single generation can create it whole cloth. And you simply have no choice but to treasure it, to pass it on, maybe to add an insight here or there, but not to discard it. Whereas traditionalism, our various forms and so on, they just don't generate life. And they need to be critiqued, examined, and maybe discarded. Most faculty at a Catholic university are not situated to do this professionally, but all should recognize its importance and be supportive of it. Fourth, the current emphasis, important emphasis, especially in the Midwest, and this is my last area, on diversity in faculty hiring and in student bodies, sometimes seems to put mission-related hiring in a second place or in a competitive posture with other priorities. We all know that few members of the faculty contribute less to the mission of our institutions than disaffected Catholics, especially tenured ones. We also know that there are faculty from other faiths, and even no faith, who make valuable contributions to the mission of our institutions. I was once asked if I would ever hire an atheist, and I said, yes. If Albert Camus applied, someone like Albert Camus, I would definitely hire them. I wouldn't put them in a theology department. But honest, open, demanding, rigorous, thoughtful, keeping the conversation honest, no question about it. There are atheists and there are atheists. There are atheists who are just pissy and grumpy, grumble, grumble, and there are Catholics that way too. So the question is, you've got to sort these things through. Whether candidates for a faculty position are Catholic or not, persons of color or not, men or women, they should be persons who can in their own way contribute to the intellectual mission of the institution. Notice I did not say the intellectual and the religious mission of the university. I don't distinguish them sharply, for the simple reason that seeking the truth of things, be it in science or the humanities, is, in my view, a religious act. All faculty must be dedicated in their very core to that search. Some faculty will engage in that search by including, more than others, intellectual themes explicitly related to the Catholic intellectual tradition. Others not. Depends on the discipline. Diversity needs to be respected and emphasized, but the most important goal is that all diversity enriches the mission of the institution. The fourth challenge, then, is how to strengthen the diversity of our faculties and student bodies while at the same time deepening our mission. As for Catholic distinctiveness, consider briefly the broad and rich agenda set for our institutions in Ex Corde Ecclesiae, John Paul II's Apostolic Constitution. Let me just read a brief part of paragraph 32. Here are the areas that he wants and suggests there be research done in: the dignity of human life, the promotion of justice for all, the quality of personal and family life, the protection of nature, the search for peace, political stability, and a more just sharing in the world's resources, and a new economic and political order that will better serve the human community at a national and international level. That's an amazing research agenda. I think that a number of our places don't reach that at all. Do you know that in Caritas in Veritate, the last encyclical by Pope Benedict, the conservative, 8 times he recommends the redistribution of wealth? Even the most liberal Democrat wouldn't say that. When you look at Catholic social teaching, it has a radical character, and it's an important statement. Some may consider this research agenda to be a limitation on academic freedom. I would rather see it as an exciting and challenging expansion of the type of research that should characterize the Catholic University, an expansion that few of our graduate programs dare to embody. Indeed, John Paul II underscored the ethical dimensions of all knowledge when he stated in paragraph 18 of that same document that all knowledge is to serve the human person, and that therefore research in the Catholic University, I'm quoting him, is always carried out with a concern for the ethical and moral implications, both of its methods and of its discoveries. This concern, the Pope continued, while it must be present in all research, is particularly important in the areas of science and technology. I'm very interested in what one of the professors is going to say, who has done a lot of work on the area of technology and theology. Talk about an odd appointment, Dan. Meet your colleague. If Catholic universities devote themselves to such research agendas, they will not only contribute to the pluralism of American higher education, they will even more importantly do so by drawing upon the Catholic intellectual traditions, which will make them truly distinctive. Keep this in mind. If all universities become internally equally diverse, they will all be the same. Just as important as diversity within an institution is diversity between institutions, a distinctiveness. So there's a plurality. And we have a distinctive contribution to make to higher ed in this country. By way of conclusion, in a rather rapid-fire way, I've outlined 4 challenges that Catholic universities face at the dawn of the 21st century. Without genuine intellectuals that treasure the Catholic intellectual tradition, and they need not be Catholics to do that, but some should be, academic leaders who understand, critique, and support Catholic intellectual traditions, the forces of the market economy may well overwhelm our institutions and turn them into training grounds for students who will fit seamlessly into corporate and government priorities. I surely hope that our colleges and universities, and especially a place like St. John's, which has such a rich history as a Catholic and Benedictine university, vigorously work to meet these challenges. Thank you very much.
Wow. Kind of an ambitious agenda. But I think we're up for it. What we want to do this afternoon now for the next half an hour or so is draw upon the resources that we have within our own community to start to look at some of these sorts of questions. And two of our colleagues have very generously agreed to join us this afternoon and offer their initial reflections on the sorts of questions that were raised by Father Heft. Noreen Hirschfeld, as Father Heft noted, has a slightly anomalous position, a little bit like our friend Dan Finn. She also has an appointment in two departments, computer science and theology. She is the Nicholas and Bernice Reuter Professor of Science and Religion at St. John's. And in an interesting way, the fact that Professor Finn and Professor Hirschfeld have these joint positions, I think says something about the nature of our institution and our willingness to actually look across disciplines and to ask hard questions about how theology might fit with a number of other disciplines that are very important to our academic, in our academic world. So Noreen is going to start and offer a few comments, but let me introduce our second speaker as well, so I won't get in the way of these conversations. Professor Michael Livingston is Professor of Psychology at St. John's. And you can read more about his bio in the program, but two things I would note about Professor Livingston is that he has managed to garner the affection and esteem and respect of two important groups of actors in the university. He's won a teaching award, clearly supporting students in their efforts to engage in academic exercise at Carleton, at St. John's, excuse me. It's the first time I've done that. I won't do it tomorrow, if I still have my job. He's been very helpful in helping students at St. John's and St. Ben's engage in intellectual activities to the degree to which he's won the Teacher of the Year Award from the Minnesota Psychological Association. But the second group of actors that he's been very involved with are faculty members. He's won the respect of his peers across the faculty at St. John's and St. Ben's, and he's been an important faculty leader. And the ability to work across both those groups is a non-trivial success on the part of Professor Livingston. So let me start by letting Professor Hirschfeld speak, and then she'll be followed by Michael Livingston, and then we'll have some time for questions from the audience as well. So, Noreen?
I think I was asked to follow Father Heft so that when I'm done, you can say you've heard the long and the short of it. When asked to say something about Catholic higher education, I thought, where to start? So I did what all of our students would do. I Googled it. And one of the first things that came up was a quote by George Bernard Shaw that said, "A Catholic university is a contradiction in terms." And I thought, is it? Well, to paraphrase Bill Clinton, it all depends on what the meaning of Catholic is and maybe what the meaning of university is. So I want to say just a little bit about both of those. First, Catholic. As an outsider looking in, I do see two very different faces to the Catholic Church. On the one hand, Catholicism sometimes looks like the last total monarchy left on the political field. Like the monarchies of old, the Catholic Church can reflect a culture of control, centralized and overregulated, giving in to the impulse to manage everything. This is the church that tells nuns what they can and cannot do, that takes certain issues off the table of discussion, and closes its ears to some theological voices. This face talks about being a church of the people, but all too often acts in the manner expressed by a bishop of Limerick, who reportedly said, "Everyone in this diocese is equal, from me on downward." But this isn't the only face of Catholicism. And here I think I was picked to follow Father Heft because I'm Exhibit A of a lot of things that he said. And I know a lot of you know me already, but I see one or two of you who don't, so that'll give me a chance to tell my story. 50 years ago this month, John the 23rd called for a council that would throw open the windows of the church to the movement of the Spirit and the change that Spirit might demand. For me, St. John's has exemplified this way of being Catholic. I came to St. John's straight out of graduate school in computer science. As a young scholar, I was attracted to computer science precisely because it was all so clean and clear. You know, either a program ran or it didn't run. Either you could prove something true or you could prove something false. You see, in some fields you can prove it one way or the other. I wanted to avoid all the messy problems that one encounters when dealing with imperfect human beings. But the more I taught, the more I came to realize that it is precisely those messy, imperfect human beings who are interesting. And the interesting things, the interesting questions for me in computer science became things like how to use computers well, when not to use them, how they change our self-perception, how they mediate our relationships, and how we try to make them over in our own image. I couldn't answer these questions as a scientist. I wasn't trained to answer these kinds of questions. So I thought, well, okay, I'll pick up a course or two from the School of Theology, and then I can answer them. So I picked up a course or two, or three, or four, or five. And as we Quakers say, way leads on to way, and pretty soon I found myself out at Berkeley getting another degree. St. John's gave me the chance to do that. They gave me a chance to follow this path, and a secular university probably would not have done that. This way of being Catholic recognizes the truth in Cardinal Newman's words, "To live is to change, and to be perfect is to have changed often." Now, I don't know about the perfect part. I certainly haven't changed often enough yet, and neither has the Church. Newman knew that. Until we are all perfect, we must embrace change. Now, my integration of science and religion brings me to the second question. Well, then what does university mean? To quote Newman again, a university is a place where 1,000 schools make contributions. 1,000 schools, 1,000 lines of inquiry. This sounds great. But sometimes I worry, and so do others. So to paraphrase Alistair McIntyre, this very multiplicity of schools, of departments and programs, of avenues of inquiry can lead to a fragmentation of knowledge and a new narrowness in our students' approach to their education. 1,000 schools. But do they tell us how to live a life where the pieces all come together into a whole? Father Heft addressed that question. Suffice it for me to say that religion has a role in this bringing together. Think for a minute about what were the biggest events in the last quarter century. Communism collapsed. The Cold War morphed into the War on Terror after 9/11. The Arab Spring is remaking the political and cultural landscape of the Middle East, and climate change is remaking the physical landscape in God knows what ways. All of these things have taken us by surprise, but they didn't need to take us by surprise. Perhaps they would not have, had we better considered the interplay of politics and science, religion and culture, had we not as a society tried to airbrush religion out of our worldview. Michael, I challenge you to embrace Pope John's open windows as a symbol of what is best about St. John's. Let in the winds of the Spirit and maybe a few Minnesota mosquitoes. Those open windows represent the St. John's I know, the St. John's that let me go to explore new ideas and integrate two disciplines that no one had thought of integrating before. They represent a St. John's that is unafraid of open inquiry, of going wherever that Spirit leads. When we do our job well, we, like Pope John, challenge our students to throw open the windows of their minds. The winds of the Spirit are going to blow through those windows, and they are going to change our students' lives in ways they cannot even imagine. I know. Thank you.
Father Heft has spoken of the importance of Catholic higher education and some of the dangers that it faces. Dr. Hertzfeld has challenged us to embrace a model of Catholic higher education that throws open the windows of the Church. What I would like to do in my brief time is to talk about three interrelated threats to Catholic and Benedictine higher education, and then to return to the broader theme that we've been discussing of the mission of the university. First, our mission is threatened by the rising price of higher education. Many students and families are saddled with debt. As of this year, the average student debt upon graduation is $27,000. Students who attend a private university such as St. John's or St. Ben's are saddled with a much greater debt load. For many, college is increasingly unaffordable. St. John's and St. Ben's, like many liberal arts colleges, are tuition dependent. If students cannot afford to come here, we will not exist. The second threat is related to the first. Increasingly, young people are abandoning identification with formal religion. According to a recent study by the Pew Forum on Religion, 20% of Americans are now nuns. That's N-O-N-E-S, as in none of the above, not nuns as in the flying nun. The largest religious group are Catholics, that represent 22% of the population. All of the Protestant religious denominations together represent 48% of the population. If we look at those individuals who are under 30, 1/3 of them are nuns. Given the very negative media portrayal of Catholicism, and it is negative, and the increasing secularization of our potential students, we face a shrinking market where fewer and fewer students will be naturally inclined to come to a place like St. John's and St. Ben's, and we may not be able to continue to exist for another 150 years. The third threat is what Dr. Heft has called commercialization, and I call corporatization. This is the idea that education is a product that is sold to a customer. That customer is the student, and the product in most cases is a set of job-related skills. We see this trend towards corporatization, or as Father Heft has called it, commercialization, everywhere. I want to be very clear on this point. Catholic higher education has always educated our students for the work world. We have a very proud tradition of educating teachers and nurses, of accountants and managers, of preparing future lawyers and doctors. But we do not do this with a narrow vocational focus. We focus on the entire individual, and because we focus on the entire individual, it is more expensive. Because we are more expensive than simple vocational training, it is becoming harder and harder for people to justify spending money on the liberal arts. Now, in light of these threats, the rising price of higher education, secularization, and corporatization, what does Catholic liberal arts higher education offer? What is our mission? Or more specifically, what does a Benedictine residential liberal arts education offered at St. John's and the College of St. Benedict provide to our students? First, we offer a rich intellectual tradition of seeking the truth across various disciplines. Second, we offer an education that attends to the entire person, to their intellect, to their character, to their spirituality, to their moral formation. Third, we offer a place where all ideas, both secular and religious, can be freely discussed and debated in our mutual search for the truth. And fourth, We offer a place where all human beings in all of our diversity are respected, accorded the dignity they deserve, and treated in the beautiful Benedictine phrase, with welcome. Our mission is religious and spiritual in the best traditions of Catholicism, and this is Catholicism with a capital C. In an increasingly fragmented and changing world, our mission is more important and valuable now than ever before. Thank you.
If we could bring up the house lights, we could now have a little bit of a conversation for maybe 15 minutes or so before we have a reception. We have microphones in both corners here. If you have questions to direct to any of our three speakers, please come forward and offer your question. Roger.
Father Heft, the title of your talk today is Challenges and Opportunities Facing Catholic Higher Education. Will there be any Catholic higher education if Catholic primary and secondary schools continue to close across the country? This past spring, in, for example, the Diocese of Philadelphia, Bishop Chaput closed or merged 17 elementary parish schools and was about to close 6 Catholic high schools until laymen got together and formed a private foundation to save all the Philadelphia high schools. Today in Philadelphia Diocese, the Catholic school enrollment is the same as it was in 1922. The peak enrollment year was 1964, and it's gone down since then. Is it not incumbent upon the Catholic Church and the bishops, as part of carrying on the faith, to save Catholic elementary schools and high schools, which will feed Catholic colleges? And as part of that, would it not be wise for the Catholic bishops to foster and promote national voucher program so that Catholic parents can afford elementary and high school education? When the tuition continues to go up, they put their students in public schools and the Catholic schools fail. If that continues, will Catholic colleges end up as just another private school of private non-sectarian school of non-Catholic students?
Okay, thank you.
You've asked a lot of questions. But first of all, I'm not sure it's the case that Catholic high schools and grade schools automatically form a feeder system for Catholic universities. Any more than some of the Catholic high schools, we have a number of graduate Catholic high schools at USC, very different place. Second, the financial crisis is huge. Part of it is because of the huge transition from a workforce, mostly sisters and brothers and so on, who are able to staff these schools and make them quite accessible and affordable. This was true until nobody anticipated after the council, as far as I know. One of the consequences would be the large exodus of religious and priests, religious, from their particular institution. So there's been this immense effort at catch-up, and very difficult. Colleges and universities got a head start. But if you think about it, when the accreditation movement started for colleges and universities, that was in the late 20s, the early 30s. be accredited, a lot of places had to have a $500,000 endowment or they wouldn't be accredited. The vast majority of Catholic colleges and universities did not have that. So what did they do? They kind of bargained with these accrediting agencies and said, look, we return all this money that we don't take, we religious, and plow it back into this institution. Let's call it a living endowment, and you give us accreditation. And they did. And that worked, as long as they were living. It wasn't until the 1950s, I'm just trying to get a historical perspective. It wasn't until the 1950s that college, and it was Notre Dame and Ted Hesper, really seriously started to do fundraising. It bothers me no end that some faculty disdain fundraisers as money growers, when in fact they're the ones that will keep institutions like this afloat, precisely because of what the faculty does that's truly excellent, brought out by both of our respondents. So I don't want to go on too long here. This is another speech. I published a book last year, a little plug, Oxford University on Catholic high schools. One whole chapter was on finance. The big threat now are charter schools. All right? What's the long-term solution? Two things. One, really embody a distinctive mission. Two, get lay boards of trustees with real fiduciary responsibility. With all due respect to bishops, most of them don't know, have never been in a regular university. The universities made that move. Chaput made the move, and we'll see how it works. I think it was a wise move to set up a kind of lay board to do this kind of work. You have to have that investment. The final argument you can make, and this is easy, if you keep closing these schools and load that onto the public system, the tax impact for ordinary taxpayers is huge. So when nothing else convinces, talk money. And I think, yes, we've gone through a thing where we've gone like this from 1966. I think it's moving like this. At this point, it's very difficult. People are finally waking up. In some cases, it's going to be too late. Catholic universities, I think, one of their major, you probably already do this as an economist, but one of the major important challenges is to build an endowment. And you have to focus, create an environment for fundraising. I'm trying to raise, there's one thing to raise it, you got alums. You got grateful alums. I don't have any alums. And I'm trying to raise money for an intellectual work. Imagine how hard that is. As someone put it humorously, I'm trying to raise money to allow liberal professors to screw up the next generation. But I'm finding those donors. I'm finding them. And we're going to build that $70 million endowment that will allow an intense place for exploring in many disciplines around the world what it means for a Catholic intellectual tradition to make a difference to the world. So it is about money, about organization, about focus, and it's about leadership.
Thank you. With all due respect, I think my pitch might be a little bit different than yours. Just no offense. So, Michael or Irene, would you like to comment on the question? Okay. Other questions? Back in the back here. If you can shout, there's a microphone, but if you can shout, we can probably hear you.
Father, thank you very much for stimulating our thinking and the faculty members as well. I can understand your aspiration of when the student was interviewed and the response conversation. What would make you happy with the response if the student was interviewed about the definition of faith? In other words, what would you like?
I'm not sure I heard it all.
So the question was, you gave the example of the student that was interviewed and gave a somewhat unpersuasive answer about faith. What would be a good answer, do you think, from your perspective from a student? And you can.
Oh, yeah, good. Now you're putting me on the spot. You're asking what I actually teach. Well, I always like interviewing interviewers. You know, I often am not settled with the question. I get a lot of media referrals at USC, and I tell interviews, especially when I hear on the telephone, that this reporter simply doesn't understand the issue. I usually say, well, I'm recording this, which kind of puts them on alert so they don't do something really arbitrary. But I think if someone says, what is faith? I would say faith is a way of living, perceiving, loving, and committing oneself to the deepest and most pervasive principles of life. They connect me to people, to the earth, and to God. Now, you know that they wouldn't have time to report that. They would edit that and... But that's the way I would try to respond. I thought that the comment by Professor Hertzfield, a lot of people quote George Bernard Shaw. He calls a Catholic university an oxymoron. I say it's a redundancy. It's a redundancy. It's not an oxymoron. And furthermore, what do you make of major state universities and even prestigious private institutions that cordon off theology and put it in a school of ministry? Or state universities will never allow theology to be taught because it's perceived as ideology. Are they really universities? That is, do they really allow all fields of inquiry? The answer is no. A Catholic university does. So that's why I say a Catholic university is a redundancy and not an oxymoron.
Now that's a pitch I can use. Thank you. Anyone else? We have time for at least one other question, maybe a couple.
The question is, when I spoke about the prophetic edges of Catholicism, sisters asked, are there some examples that you have of this? And I would say, sure. Among them would be the dignity and freedom of every human being, number one. Who would have expected 100 years ago that one of the most powerful proponents on the world stage of human rights would have been John Paul II? It's amazing. I have my criticisms of him and blah, 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 but that was an extraordinary kind of thing. The second would be in an age of globalization where, and Dan has written about this extremely well, where the market is one that often provides greater wealth for quite a few people than ever before, also leaves a lot of people out. And it can have profoundly negative effects in terms of resources and things, exploitation. The Catholic Church to continue to say those things, to challenge. I remember I quoted from Caritas and Verity. If you haven't read that document, it's really an extraordinary text. You know, so I think that would be a second area. Catholic social teaching would be critically important. Sexual ethics, big challenge, big challenge. Sister Margaret Farley, as some of you know, published a book just recently, 2007, was criticized. And I read through parts of the book. Once a book is condemned, I read it, like many of you. But I could see what she was driving at. I could see what she was driving at. One of the things we're going to be holding up, we've worked with the University of Dayton and the Institute, we're going to do this next September, is we're going to have a conference on Catholic intellectual life, predicament and promise. We're going to get the advertisement out just now. Another way to ask, to say what that conference is about, is it possible to ask, to have public conversations about difficult issues in the church? Why or why not? And if we can show and demonstrate that we can do that, we can have public conversations about difficult issues in respect, I think that would be prophetic, especially given our political culture.
Maybe one last question?
Surely, local professors here should answer that question. Wimps. There are late bloomers, I find. Late bloomers, that is, people that can leave with a preoccupation of getting a good job and having a debt on their backs, and only subsequently, years later, begin to appreciate what was given. I think for us to expect students at the time to really recognize what it is that they got would be rather difficult. It's kind of rare, in my experience. I have had, I don't know if you had the experience, you can have a graduate come back and say, you know, it really was good. I don't know if he said that loudly at Harvard at that time. Maybe still there. But it takes a while for that to really connect. But I think that once they begin to see that, it works. The second thing is, you can always make the economic argument. If you read a recent book by Mark Roche, who was the dean of the College of Arts and Letters at Notre Dame, it's a wonderful book. Why the Liberal Arts? It should be required reading here. And while he makes, I think, elegant arguments in the book, one of the chapters, of course, as usual, you know, they say when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Today, everything is in economic terms. And he makes the argument about people who graduate with liberal arts degrees and what they do and what they can do and how they do make money. The other thing I think is important, there is more wealth in the Catholic community in the United States than ever before. My view, and this goes back to another question, but I think this is important. They're going to be generous, some of them will be, but they have a lot of people knocking on their door. They don't want their money going down a rat hole. If we can show them an investment that will make a difference for generations, we will do them a favor. As I say, I can ease your conscience for being wealthy. I'm being a little facetious, but it is true. It is true. They're looking for that, and if you can convince them that this will change generations, people will give. And I think these two institutions, St. Ben, St. John's, has some really great stuff. You got to get out and you got to find these people. And it takes more than one or two persons to do that. Another plug for the development office.
Thank you very much, Father Heft, for your very stimulating comments. Thank you, Professor Herzfeld and Professor Livingston, for taking the time to reply today. These conversations will be ongoing. I can assure you that my colleague Mary Ann Benninger and I will work very hard to make the Catholic University a redundancy in the years to come, in central Minnesota at least. So thank you very much. We're going to have a reception out in the lobby. There'll be some books for sale out there, another plug. And at 5:30, you're welcome to join the monastic community for evening prayer in the Abbey Church. And there's some other activities tomorrow that you might be interested in if you're really bored. You can check the schedule, but 2 o'clock there's an inauguration or something. So if you're available, we'd love to see you there as well. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, and thank you to our guests.